A pastor turned executioner, a forest that became a graveyard, and hundreds of graves still being unearthed. How can a man behind bars keep directing starvation deaths from the shadows? Stay with us to the end, and we'll connect the dots on lost crimes inside the occult, the Shakahola starvation deaths of Pastor Paul Mackenzie. Born in 1972, Paul Nthenge Mackenzie moved through life largely unnoticed by most Kenyans. To neighbors in Malindi, on Kenya's coast, he looked ordinary. A former street vendor and taxi driver with secondary schooling, he apprenticed under a Malindi preacher in the late 1990s, preparing to spread his own message. Everything shifted in 2003. Convinced of his religious calling, he founded the Good News International Church, a Christian fellowship that would eventually claim 3,000 members across branches in Kenya. He was charismatic. Followers spoke of miracles, exorcisms, and his generosity. Among his adherents were teachers and police officers. But beneath the public image, his sermons grew increasingly radical. Mackenzie did not present himself as a politician or an academic. He styled himself as an enlightened pastor. The promise he offered was simple and dangerous. Reject schooling, reject medicine, withdraw from the world, and fast until you meet Jesus. His rise to a messianic figure was not accidental. The biography reads like a calculated radicalization. First, he denounced education, calling it a demonic invention that pulled children away from faith. Then he condemned modern medicine, insisting that God alone heals. His preaching forbade vaccines, treatments, and hospital visits. Gradually, under the banner of preparing for the end of the world, he introduced the most extreme practice, fast until death, because, he claimed, that path reached heaven faster. That doctrine turned him into a man pursued by the law and shifted him from marginal preacher to the epicenter of a sect accused of causing hundreds of deaths by starvation, strangulation, and beatings. In 2017, he first faced charges for radicalization. In 2019, he was briefly detained after preaching that the government's plan to assign national ID numbers was satanic. That same year, he shut down his church, telling followers that Jesus said his assignment is finished. To many, it sounded less like an ending and more like a pivot. The new vision, a sealed-off community where his word could reign without interference. The name of the place would become synonymous with horror, Shakahola. Deep in Kilifi County, far from main roads and official eyes, Mackenzie urged followers to relocate, cut all ties, and wait for the rapture through fasting. He secured about 800 acres of forest, a wild belt where elephants and big cats still move. There, members paid small sums for plots, built simple houses, and settled into hamlets with biblical names like Nazareth. As the settlement grew, the rules hardened. People in different villages were forbidden to meet or speak across boundaries. Mackenzie's own thatched house, with a single solar panel, was dubbed Ikulu, the State House. From a distance, it looked almost idyllic, a community living off the grid. Up close, it was controlled. Life inside was closer to hell. Fasting was no longer private devotion. It became an enforced ritual. Mackenzie's enforcers watched the weak, assaulted those at the edge of starvation, and removed the near dying. Many were never seen again. Women reported abuse. Anyone trying to leave without permission risked beatings, and those caught breaking the fast were punished. Parents were told not to feed their children. The cruelest contradiction arrived with a single open door. Police later reported finding milk and bread in Mackenzie's refrigerator while his followers starved nearby. Around this period, he received 18 months in jail for screening unlicensed films. To his believers, these brushes with the law proved persecution. To the state, they were warning signs it failed to stop in time. April 2023 was the breaking point, the moment everything spilled into daylight. It began as rumors of disappearances. Neighbors and families reported loved ones entering Shakahola and never returning. Those who staggered out were emaciated, on the edge of death. Police moved in. What they found defied expectation. Bodies in shallow graves, children skeletal with hunger, adults in terminal decline. The rescues were chaotic. Some died in transit to hospitals. Others refused food even after extraction. One survivor clamped her mouth shut, rejecting first aid and nourishment entirely. Autopsies stripped away any doubt. Most deaths were from starvation. But there were also cases of strangulation, asphyxia, and blunt force trauma, proof that when hunger did not kill fast enough, human hands accelerated it. The numbers surged. Dozens became hundreds. Week after week, exhumations raised the toll. By August 2023, officials were already speaking of more than 400 victims. Shakahola became a byword for horror. In response, the government of William Ruto pledged a crackdown on extremist churches, a national registry of religious organizations, financial audits for preachers, tighter oversight. Yet, even as policy speeches multiplied, the cult's imprint remained, its teachings echoing in survivors who still refused care and in graves that kept giving up the dead. The toll from that first wave passed more than 400 victims, a number that shocked the world in 2023. A pattern emerged. Most deaths were from starvation, but autopsies also showed strangulation and blunt force trauma. There were multiple burials in single pits, and in several clusters the bodies of children appeared at the front of the so-called batches, as if they were led first toward death. The concealment was systematic. Shallow graves remained scattered across different pockets of the forest, and thickets used to hide decomposing bodies, techniques that complicated any true count. This was not simply a group fasting to death. It looked like an organized program with methods and enforcers. How does a doctrine turn hunger into salvation? Mackenzie persuaded hundreds that starving to death was the surest path to heaven. He did it by fusing apocalyptic fear with promises of purity. The sermons drew a picture of a corrupt world, an inevitable end, and an imminent rapture. Prove your faith, he said, with the ultimate sacrifice. Give up life itself. Repeated without pause, that rhetoric captured parents, turning some into accomplices in their children's deaths, not with a single order, but with a drumbeat of obedience, shame, and the promise that suffering would be counted as holiness. In January 2024, Paul Nthenge, Mackenzie, and 30 co-accused were formally charged with 191 counts of child murder. Hearings multiplied across Shanzu, Malindi, and Mombasa, each track focusing on a different strand of the case: homicide, terror offenses, radicalization, and torture. Mackenzie was in custody that year, shuttled between courts as prosecutors laid out parallel dockets built from exhumations, survivor testimony, and forensic reports. Following this scandal, many Kenyans went out to demolish and destroy the now-closed church that Mackenzie had created. In court, he cut an unexpected figure. Unshaven, in a loose black and pink track jacket, he looked nothing like the country's flamboyant televangelists who favored tailored suits and visible wealth. The contrast was striking. A man accused of engineering mass starvation and ritualized control, standing quietly in the dock, while clerks read out charges that stretched into the hundreds, and families waited for a measure of accountability. Yet even as the courts moved slowly and he remained in custody, his network seemed alive. What looked contained in 2023 surfaced again in 2025. New graves appeared in Kwa, about 30 kilometers from the original epicenter. In barely 1 week, authorities recovered 32 bodies. Taken together, the two discovery waves brought the known toll in the Shakahola Forest to about 446. Kwa is a small settlement of roughly 140 houses and a single shop, without running water. It rarely sees visitors. Now, police tape circles the area where officials recorded 34 bodies and 102 body parts. The fresh finds overwhelmed morgues and examiners. Exhumations paused so teams could collect DNA, take radiographs, and then proceed to autopsies, a sequence that slowed identifications and left families waiting for answers. The ground had changed, yet the pattern was identical. Clandestine graves, decomposed remains, entire families missing. Within a week, 32 bodies were exhumed. 11 suspects were arrested in coordinated raids, believed to be spreading Mackenzie's doctrine. Kenya's Interior Minister, Kipchumba Murkomen, publicly linked the new graves to the same cult, saying survivors reported that Mackenzie prayed over them from prison and that his influence remained intact despite the bars. Many survivors were relocated to new communities, but most received little follow-up care. Too many drifted, weakened and confused. Some returned to the very doctrine that had nearly killed them. The case of Jairus and Lillian makes the point. Rescued with their 6 children in 2023, they were moved to Siaya in western Kenya to rebuild. In March 2025, Jairus told his extended family he had found work in Bondo. The truth was different. He boarded a bus with his wife and children and traveled more than 900 kilometers back to Kilifi, returning to the cult's territory. Months later, during a police raid, officers found the couple in the forest. At the station, in front of a relative, they confessed that all 6 children had died and were buried in Kwa Binzaro. The names Flora, Mary, Christine, Shadrach, Esther, and Tani became a heartbreaking shorthand for the cult's pull, strong enough to draw back even those who had already been rescued. That influence from behind bars ignited public outrage. How could a man in custody, accused in the worst recent religious mass casualty case in the country, still access phones and communication channels to reach followers? Human rights groups such as Hockey Africa warned that Mackenzie continued preaching the fast until death gospel from his cell, while accomplices outside echoed his directives. The idea that a defendant on terror and murder charges could communicate from prison fueled a national outcry. Advocates pressed the government to tighten controls on phone use in prisons, arguing the doctrine was spreading like a virus. The courts offered little comfort. In early 2024, Mackenzie and 30 co-accused were formally charged, yet cases multiplied across venues and moved slowly. By September 2025, there was no final judgment. Mackenzie remained in remand, denying all charges, even as new graves were discovered. Justice crawled while the horror advanced in long strides. Now, Mackenzie stands charged alongside 94 co-authors. The case remains open in the courts and in the public memory. Mackenzie stays in custody. His followers are scattered but active. Families of the victims exist between grief and the wait for justice. The forests of Shakahola and Kwa Binzaro have become silent cemeteries, witnesses to a tragedy that still has no closure. In early September 2025, Mackenzie claimed that suspicious substances had been planted in his prison cell to harm him, alleging an attempted poisoning. He told the court he found shards of broken glass near the spot where he eats and noticed a whitish residue around the neck of his water bottle, which he framed as an assassination attempt. These are his allegations from custody, raised amid ongoing proceedings and intensifying public scrutiny. The scale of the deaths forced a wider public reckoning. How could hundreds follow one man to the point of death? What conditions let such an extreme message take root? Analysts pointed to the vulnerability of underserved rural communities, the absence of basic services, and the pull of Pentecostal spaces that offer certainty in an uncertain world. For many, Mackenzie filled a void. He promised salvation, meaning, and belonging. The price was life itself. Looking back, Mackenzie's story is not only the tale of a radicalized pastor. It is the story of a country confronting its institutional fragility, the exposure of its communities, and the enduring question of how far faith can go when it turns into a weapon. It is also an ominous reminder. The cult persists even with its leader behind bars. Phones, networks, and rumors keep the flame of a doctrine alive that recasts hunger as supposed salvation. Until those voices are quieted, and until vulnerable communities are heard and supported, new graves will continue to open in the forest. Thank you for watching. If this work matters to you, please like the video, subscribe to Lost Crimes, and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next.